It's no secret that TCGs are more popular than ever. In fact, we're probably in the middle of the biggest bubble in TCG history. But this one feels a bit different than the last one. Previously, TCGs would power creep their game and sort of entice players to buy new cards using pay-to-win tactics. But now, things have changed to cards being seen more as speculative assets, with tactics like artificial scarcity and fear of missing out being the way that companies are now enticing players to purchase new cards. But I think there's a bit more to it than that. We've kind of seen this trend across multiple different genres of games besides just trading card games. And so today, I wanted to take a look at the different motivations that players have for playing games and contrast those with the different motivations people have for buying things. And through overlapping the reasons why we play with the reasons why we pay, we might be able to uncover some interesting patterns about why games tend to evolve into similar states. There's a lot to cover today, so let's get into it.
Distraction makers.
When we first start talking about the reasons why players play games, the framework that has been used for many years now is Bartle taxonomy. I think as a general purpose framework, this makes a lot of sense, right? You're merely looking at the logical possibilities of a player, what a player is able to do and what a system is able to do, and the contrast between them, which we've talked about a lot previously with things like Csikszentmihalyi's flow state, right? There's a certain amount of analysis that you can do based on the agency of a player and the systemic forces put upon them. But I do feel like this particular Bartle taxonomy framework misses a bit of nuance. And so recently, there's been this, what I would consider maybe the newest, like the new gold standard for player motivations, and that's Quantic Foundry's gamer motivation model. And from my understanding, the way that Quantic Foundry arrived at their gamer profiles was done through first defining these motivations by gamers and then running an experiment, basically, that had over 500,000, maybe more at this point, participants that basically took a survey that categorized them into the type of gamer that they were based on answering questions that fit the different motivation models. Now, we'll talk through this. I'm sure this is getting convoluted. And so the survey itself is still available. You can take it through their website. The link will be in the description if you're interested. But first, let's go over their motivational model. Their motivational model is split into 6 broad categories with 2 subcategories within each of them. The broad categories are action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity. And within each of them, we have 2 different motivators. So under action, we have destruction and excitement. This might be what we would, in Magic terminology, call a Timmy player, right? There's somebody who's motivated by big splashy effects and fun, chaotic things that they can do within sort of this creative sandbox of the game. There's the social motivation, and this, I think, is interesting that it's split into 2 categories of competition and community, both of these being social. And I think, for me, this is really interesting because when I have mentioned casual competitive gameplay, that I often get this feedback of that those are like an oxymoron, that those 2 things don't exist together. And here, I think, is where we see that they can both sort of fall under the same motivating profile, which is that you want to interact with other players. It's just that you're sort of doing it through 2 different methods, right? You're hanging out or you are meeting up with other people to compete. The motivating factor is still a social one. This tracks with my own experience, although anecdotal, where one of the ways that my social circle was grown was through going to Friday Night Magic tournaments. You get to know the people that are there and you interact with them in a social way. You're not just there to compete. I think the other aspect that's interesting with the social dynamic of competition is that your rank as a player becomes an important indicator of your sort of status within that community, where in a more casual setting, that isn't really the case. There might be other things that indicate your status within that social group, but your sort of competitive achievements probably aren't one of them. Next, we have mastery, and this is motivated by challenge and also strategy. And it's important to note here that competition is separate from mastery, right? Where mastery can be a solo endeavor. It can be connected to competition, but it isn't necessarily the same. Next, we have achievement. This one I find pretty fascinating, that the motivating factors for achievement can also be sort of split in this a little bit competitive and casual way, where the casual form of achievement is collecting, and the maybe more competitively minded motivator would be power. But power can be achieved through player versus player, but also player versus environment, right? Like your character leveling up, right, is a form of achievement. And I think that the ability to track your progress towards achieving something, I think, really defines this category. Next, we have immersion, which is defined by fantasy and story. This is, I think, a category that illustrates that system versus player dynamic, where the fantasy is individually motivated, right? It's role playing, it's coming up with your own character, and how the game allows you to realize that vision that you have for yourself, versus story, which would be more on the system side, where this is the pre-written plot and characters that a lot of games rely on to sort of move a player through the experience. And finally, we have creativity, which is design and discovery. Again, we see that system and player dynamic, where design is player motivated. It's probably an intrinsic motivation of what can I create with this system that I've been presented with, rather than the discovery side of it, which is what do I find within this world that I am exploring. And what you find is gated by the system. And then Quantic Foundry developed some player segmentations, and I think, from my understanding, the motivations were sort of at the front end of their hypothesis, and then the surveys themselves help them develop the player segments on the back end based on different scores in each of the categories, where some were high and some were low, and they created player profiles based on those combinations. We're not going to necessarily get into the player segments in this video. There's a lot to uncover there, but for our purposes, we're really interested in the things that motivate somebody to play the game. Oh, the other thing to mention here is that a player can have lots of combinations of these things. It's not like a player is purely defined by one of them, and that's where those player profiles come in, as combinations of these different motivating factors. Just to recap, so we're on the same page, we have action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity. Okay, so next we're going to move into the reasons why we pay, right? What motivates somebody to buy something? And the framework for this that we're going to be using was based on a paper by Sheth, Newman, and Gross back in 1991 that was called Why We Buy What We Buy, A Theory of Consumption Values. I'm going to explain sort of their framework, but we're going to change it slightly just so that it fits more in line with gaming generally. So they split the motivation to buy something into 5 factors. You have functional, which means purchasing this will improve my ability in some way. These are things like tools. You have social reasons for buying something, which means that if I buy this thing, this is part of the way that a group that I belong to identifies, or if I buy this thing, it will improve my standing, my social standing. Next, there's the emotional factor, which this is part of self-identity rather than identity as part of a group. Purchasing this will express something about who you are. Next is epistemic, and this is purchasing this will teach me something. I will learn something from buying this. So often these are tutorials, classes, coaching, those kinds of things. But this also could be behind the scenes or lore compendiums, right? Some kind of, I seek knowledge in some way, and by purchasing this thing, I will acquire some new knowledge. And finally, we have conditional, and conditional is buying something that you would never be able to buy again, or that somebody else wouldn't be able to buy. So these could be things like handmade items or legacy, like founder rewards, like you're buying into, again, kind of motivated by a cause, but you're getting some kind of a reward based on that contribution that would not be available outside of that specific circumstance. Okay, so to expand our reasons for why we pay things into sort of the problems that we're dealing with in gaming today, we can look at ways that the way to buy things, or the reason why people would buy things, has been sort of hacked, right? Which of these motivating factors to purchase something is susceptible to predatory monetization tactics? So if we look at functional, right? If you're buying something because you want it to improve your ability, this is pretty susceptible to pay to win, right? You're able to purchase something that makes you more powerful, which makes you more capable. There's also the risk here of artificial friction. So if there's something in the system that is hampering your ability to do something, you could charge someone to bypass that artificial barrier. And that would improve your ability, your functionality, right? Next, we have social. Some of the ways that this can be exploited is through artificial scarcity. So if you and the people in your group are able to get a thing and other people aren't, that can become an indicator for your group that you are associated with that thing that other people can't get for whatever reason. This also works for like a manufactured hierarchy. So if you buy your way into like a VIP program, that kind of thing, this could work for cosmetics in a game, or just being part of an elite group, right? You have purchased your way into being part of a group, which would be a manufactured hierarchy effectively. There's also the like items that are sort of pay to flex items rather than pay to win, which is like items that people know to be particularly expensive. If you are able to purchase them, that would, again, make you part of sort of that manufactured group, right? You are one of the people who could afford to buy this thing, therefore you are wealthy or whatever. And if you're wealthy, then you're capable. If you're somebody that thinks that kind of thing is true. The other thing here is, again, part of becoming a group, you might be able to purchase something that makes you feel your ability is that of other people within this more elite group that you would want to be a part of. For instance, if a group of athletes all buy Nike shoes or something, if you buy Nike shoes, you are therefore a better basketball player, right? Even though that probably doesn't have much of an impact. It might have some, right? But that moves into the functional category potentially. But here with social, it's I am representing a particular brand that is the same brand associated with people I perceive as being good at this thing. So if I buy that thing, then I will also therefore be good, even though that's not logically true, right? Next, for the emotional category, some of the ways that this can be exploitative is that you can create manufactured sentimentality. This is often done through charity drives or whatever, where there's this pretty clear designation of if you pay us money, you will save this puppy or child in danger, whatever it is, right? It's a way to appeal to emotion to get somebody to spend money. This also works with nostalgia, right? Is that if you are able to associate emotional self-identity of something that people are invested in from when they're young, and you bring it back to them when they're older, they might associate those positive feelings from when they're younger with this new thing, even though those two things don't really have anything to do with each other. And then the way that epistemic can be sort of hacked is in experience gating, right? Basically saying like, I have this ability and this knowledge, and if you want access to it, you have to give me money, and then that will give you the learning. And like, obviously that isn't necessarily exploitative. The way that it can be is if it's manufactured, right? If somebody is giving off signals that they are an expert, but then you buy their course or whatever, it ends up just being nothing much that you couldn't have maybe just learned on your own. And finally, conditional, the way that this becomes exploitative is through manufactured scarcity. So that's either limited quantities or limited time in buying something, and that leads to the fear of missing out, which we're all very familiar with in the trading card game space. Okay, so let's now take the reasons why people pay and overlay them onto why people play. And that way we can see which of the 12 motivating factors here are most susceptible to the most exploitative tactics of the reasons why people buy things. I think that the broad categories that are most susceptible to the predatory monetization practices are probably the social and achievement gamers, which makes sense, right? Because there's a certain amount of overlap between both competitive-minded players and casual-minded players. Competition can really move players towards pay-to-win, where they would be able to increase their ability to compete by buying more powerful things. If the group that you are a part of sees themselves as one that does invest in these particular parts of the game or values scarcity in some way, values rare items, or that would potentially contribute to you wanting to make sure that you're able to get those rare items as a group identifier. And then the achievement side of this, I think the achievement side is the most susceptible, right? This is collection and power. The power fantasy that I am a part of is susceptible to pay to win. It's susceptible to artificial scarcity if those items are more powerful and only available for a limited time. But also the collecting side of this and the motivating factor to complete your kind of collection, I think easily falls under this category. But I think what's difficult about the power as a motivating factor is that this needs to be on a continuous treadmill, right? If you just continually power creep the game, and we can see this with Magic, in that if the motivating factor of your players is to infinitely become more powerful, the game itself can't sustain that forever. But if you lean into the collectability aspects of the game, you could be on that treadmill forever, theoretically. I suppose there could be something like novelty creep, right? Or gimmick creep, where you eventually have made too many things that are rare. I think this is basically what caused like the Beanie Baby crash, where you would make too many things that are rare, and eventually you sort of like pile up too many things, and so no individual item is all that rare anymore because there's too many rare items generally, right? It's like everybody can have one rare item, therefore some of them are still rare, but if everybody can have some of them, maybe that's enough. Next, I think action and immersion are the two things that are second sort of most susceptible to the predatory game tactics, where obviously you can have this escalation of power that equals greater ability through functionality and pay to win, where you would be buying things that are just more explosive, right? You're able to make a greater impact on the game world through your purchases, but it's not quite, I don't think it's quite as susceptible as something like competition, where your ability to compete at all is tied to your ability to have the more powerful items, right? Where if the players that are around you are on that escalation curve, you must continue on it as well. Otherwise, your ability to compete and participate in that community becomes compromised. And I think that's the big crux with the difference between a sort of casual community and a competitive community, although competitive communities can step off that treadmill. We're seeing that with things like pre-modern. And finally, immersion, I think, is somewhat susceptible to this, mainly through selling cosmetics to players that want to realize their character, or through story moments that are limited, that sort of thing. But if you're monetizing your game through this category of immersion, through fantasy or through story is not a reusable resource, right? It's not a renewal. You have to create more story and keep players on that story treadmill, which is a relatively large investment to do. And finally, we have mastery and creativity, which I think are probably the least susceptible to these monetization tactics. Mastery is somewhat susceptible to pay to win, but it really undercuts this motivation profile by you purchasing your way to greater ability, right? It's if your motivating factor is sort of self-improvement and mastery of a game systems, if you instead subvert that and just buy your way to the top, I don't think that this particular player profile would be satisfied. It's not the achievement itself that they're after. That's part of the achievement profile. It's the mastery of the systems and self-improvement. And so really the way that you would sell to these players is through coaching, right? It's through improving their own abilities. And I don't really think that many game companies are all that interested in selling coaching to their players. In fact, in a lot of ways, designing a game that requires coaching will limit the audience that's able to play it, especially at that level. But I would also assume that this player profile is generally a more niche audience. It also requires that the game be crafted with a lot of expertise, right? And a system that introduces a lot of game pieces over time to sort of feed these other ways of monetization, I think is actively hostile to an environment that is well maintained and well balanced for a mastery type of player. Imagine if new chess pieces were coming out every month and you had to learn the new moves and incorporate it into the strategy of the game, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense for people to be on that mastery curve at that point. And finally, we have creativity, which is design and discovery. And I do think that the discovery side of this is monetizable, where you would be adding more things for the player to uncover and a bigger and bigger world to explore. But this has similar problems to the story side of content creation, where you have to be on that treadmill where you're producing more things for players to uncover. On the design side of this, I could see players wanting to buy more options, but it's possible that they would have enough of them, or that those options need to be generic enough to build something interesting that doesn't really make a lot of sense to continue to sell them without moving into a different category. So it'd be something like basic Lego bricks or Minecraft, right? Where a basic Lego brick can be built, that can build a multitude of different things, but you don't need to necessarily buy a whole lot of different Lego bricks to do that. And so you start to move into sort of the collectability side of things, or the emotional side of things, with something like nostalgia, going to Simpsons or Harry Potter or Star Wars or whatever it is, so that purchasers would want to buy the same stuff they might already own, because this one now represents this other thing that they're interested in, even though they could use basic Lego bricks to build their own X-Wing, right? So if we're looking at this player profile as somebody who would actually just rather own the regular bricks and just build their own X-Wing, it's kind of tough to monetize that motivation, right? Okay, well, that was a lot to get through. I think the achievement motivator is really the most susceptible here because it's pay to win, but also collecting. And that is, I think, the dichotomy, right, of the shift where we see with Magic is that it used to be them focused on, I think, the pay to win side of things, right, where they're using tournaments and events to incentivize achievement to become part of that social group. And now this, I think it's much more focused on the collectability. When we look at the incentives and how player profile motivations and the reasons why people buy things overlap, you have this sort of harmony all coalescing in sort of achievement-based gamers, whether that's if players want to increase their power to be able to participate in their social groups, or if they want to improve their collection to be able to improve in their social groups. I think those are similar motivating factors, but one of them requires the game itself to be in a state that makes sense to be played competitively or to be played in that tournament environment, where the other side of it, not so much, right? So I don't know. That's where I think the split is happening now. And if we're thinking about increasing the number of players that are playing the game and whether or not that's a good thing, let's come back to that question at the beginning. And I think it does depend on the player motivations, right? If the player is motivated to play the game for a reason that is correlated with the game's quality, the gameplay quality, then I think that's a good thing. But if a motivating factor for a player to join the game is not correlated with that, and it's more correlated with the collectability aspects of the game, I do think that creates some weird incentives. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you want to join a community of like-minded game designers, you can join our Discord. The link is in the description. There's also links to each of the studies I used for the frameworks. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, like the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.